our participants across the globe, including, looks like North America, Africa, Europe, the UK, and perhaps other points around the world. And welcome from me, Mary Hemmingson. I am currently in Vancouver, Canada, your moderator, with collaborator Andy Calitz, who you know is based in the UK. And together we continue our series of touring energy facilities and regional development in various countries, drawing on our respective insights, including the insights of this group, to understand the role they play in the energy transition and touch on the direction of travel in that country or globally. And today, we continue our series of these global energy tours in presenting the United States and its role, its significant role in the energy transition. And for those of you who've joined before, that follows on our previous tours of hydropower, electricity storage, Europe, solar, China, LNG, India, and the last one being nuclear. And through these and subsequent tours with questions and answers and your shared contributions, we seek to help context our energy system and inform the energy transition considerations. As those who've joined before know, our efforts focus on exploring primary energy, such as our upcoming July wind focus tour, and then layering these into regional tours in today's US-based tour. As context, I actually spent a lot of time in the US on energy-related matters in my portfolio life and can attest personally to the snapshot that we are providing and the pivot points we present associated with the US energy position and pathways going forward. And a point of emphasis, a key element in the US that I would call out is it is not to be underestimated in its size and diversity in the energy space, including in the range of energy policies that are channeled at the state levels. And that's quite a bit different for those of you who operate in this space from other regions where there's much more of a centralist planning approach. And a second element, and I just came off a series of strategy sessions for the companies that I'm on the board of, is in its current thrust of growth, and make no mistake, the US is growing. There is significant growth in electric demand and significant growth in further electrification. And I believe that its grid is vulnerable as it's aged and not on track with the level of investment required to both renew and extend. So I'll leave that as a bit of a spoiler alert and to be a bit provocative in the context. We will look from the group for others to contribute their perspectives. And as a heads up, we plan to call on Alex and Terry to do so at the conclusion of the presentation and kind of start the dialogue with the questions, answers, and contributions. So as we start the tour, we are extending our standard time from 60 minutes to 90 minutes to accommodate the scope of the US in the energy transition. So Andy's going to present for about 45 minutes and we have extra time for questions and contributions. Consistent with our previous presentations, we will provide the presentation and record the tour so we can enable its distribution. And we're looking forward to your questions and contributions. So please pose those in the chat, in the Zoom chat during the session. I will be compiling them and allocating them to either Andy or I. So now, as I always say, fasten your seatbelts, turn off your cameras and your audio, and let's start the tour.
Thank you, Mary. And before we start our tour today, let me make 6 defining remarks about the US energy system. The first one is that it's a market-driven system, and unlike some countries which are state-controlled energy sectors, the US relies heavily on a market-based system in the private sector, and that system can deploy capital and technology and expertise faster than any other energy system in the world. The second one is that in terms of primary energies, the US boasts a very diverse mix of sources, and oil and natural gas currently rain, but coal and nuclear and hydro and renewables and wind, including wind and solar, play very significant roles. And that provides considerable security against price shocks or supply disruptions in any fuel source. Third one, as Mary said, is the US energy policy is a complex web involving both the federal and state regulations. And the federal government sets broad energy policies, but individual states have considerable authority over their own energy mixes and utility regulation and environmental standards. Fourth comment is that a significant portion of the US energy infrastructure, unlike China that we looked at recently, including its power grids, including its pipelines, including its nuclear fleet, including its coal fleet, is aging, and very substantial investment needs are required to see reliability and efficiency. And then the US's dramatic increase in domestic oil and natural gas production as a result of shale oil and gas extraction technologies is an indication of what I said earlier of how rapidly the US can deploy capital and technology. And last comment would be, as we will see today, there has been very significant growth in renewable energy sources, wind and solar, and state incentives, federal incentives, technological advancement, all driving this trend. Our journey today reminds us that the US has achieved energy independence, something that is so important to every US president in the past 2 decades. And the Inflation Reduction Act has been implemented by President Biden during his stay in office. And that Inflation Reduction Act has made $300 billion available for the energy transition financing for clean technologies, including renewables, including electric vehicles, power grid investment, and more. And a lot of that is being bolstered by a wide range of tax incentives included in that Inflation Reduction Act. But let's start, as we usually do, and just look at the overall energy position, the energy position of the United States.
Yes.
Could that
please
Anthony,
mute.
could you just mute, please?
Yes, sir. I'm sorry, it's 7 a.m. here, and I'm actually in the middle of a conference call already. Can we speak a little bit later? Sorry, can everyone
mute? Can everyone mute, please?
Oil is the largest at 38% of primary energy in the country. Secondly, gas at 33%. Then we see that even in 2024, coal is still the third largest source of energy at 10%, nuclear 8%, wind is 4%, and then joint sixth at 2% each are hydro and solar and biofuels. If we add up all the lines that we see on screen, you can quite clearly see that overall energy demand in the US has been flat since the year 2000. With energy efficiency largely offsetting all economic growth, a good thing for the United States. And if we ask ourselves how self-sufficient is the United States, it is very clear that it is self-sufficient in terms of oil. Coal is exported, so it's self-sufficient. Gas is exported, but solar panels are imported and wind turbines are imported. We start then with the largest source of energy in the country. And contrary to popular belief, the US produces oil at 13 million barrels per day, which ranks at first ahead of Saudi and ahead of Russia. And as we will see shortly, current oil storage levels are low enough, some concern to the Biden administration. Now, the shale revolution that a number of people are quite familiar with on this call transformed the US in recent years, thanks to hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling technologies, which unlocked a vast amount of oil trapped in shale rock formations and led to a surge of almost 5 million barrels per day of domestic oil production. And that occurs in the Permian, which is in Texas and New Mexico, the Eagle Ford, which is also in southern Texas, the Haynesville, which is in Louisiana and Texas, the Utica, up in the northeast of the country in New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. The Marcellus, which sits in the so-called Appalachian geological basin, covers Pennsylvania and West Virginia and Ohio and New York, and the Bakken of North Dakota and Montana, and that extends into Canada. And currently, the EIA, the Energy Information Administration of the US, expects oil production to be at about 3.2 million barrels per this year, and still grow in 2025 to 13.7 million barrels per year. Let's visit just two places in the oil scene. The first one is the Permian, and the second one is the Gulf of Mexico. And we stare down from space at each of those white dots that you see as a drill pad of the Permian, which has propelled the US to be the largest oil producer in the world, as I said earlier, now self-sufficient in oil. And it sits there in the western corner of Texas and New Mexico. And currently there were at peak 400 wells drilling, rigs drilling wells at the time. And each, if we add up all the white dots that you see, you'll see 35,000 wells that have been drilled in the area. And the 5 million barrels of oil produced by the Permian that we see below us, largely on private property, is as large as the largest oil fields in Saudi Arabia. We next very briefly go to the Gulf of Mexico because it is such a major oil and gas producer for the US, accounting for about 20% of domestic crude oil production. And that the shallow water has now been exhausted, and production is now concentrated in deep water, with many of the platforms, such as this one, operating in 2 kilometers deep water. And there are probably currently 3,500 active wells in operation that are producing oil and gas into the US. BP and Shell and Chevron and ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips were the dominant operators of these platforms, such as the one that we see here. The ones we see here is the Argos platform. It is a BP platform in the Gulf of Mexico. Sits in ultra deep water, and BP has developed this with Woodside and Chevron, and there are many of these that you see here with names that are legendary from each of the companies that I named earlier. I pause for a moment on the US Strategic Petroleum Reserve. US has, since the days that OPEC was formed, the oil crisis, the IEA was formed, as today a capacity of 700 million barrels of crude oil storage. And when the Russia-Ukraine war started, President Biden historically reached a very large, almost half of that, to deal with the global supply disruption caused by the war and to keep the American market well supplied. And so currently there are only 340 million barrels of oil in that. And you look down, that is split across 4 locations in the United States, but this is the biggest. It sits in Texas at a place called Big Hill. And you can see where the red dots are, where oil is injected into naturally formed salt caverns. This by itself can store 160 million barrels. And currently the Department of Energy is out with a request for proposal to purchase oil at a time when prices seem to be slightly lower. This picture is a very significant picture in terms of looking at how the primary energy balance of the United States has changed. We see at the top the growth during the 1960s and 70s and 80s and 90s, and then the US plateauing in terms of primary energy consumption, roughly in the year 2005, also when its carbon emissions peaked. And we can see how production stepped up since 2010 as a result of that shale oil and gas production that we looked at a moment ago. And we can also see that as a result of particularly LNG exports, which started in 2016, that oil exports, that primary energy exports or gas exports are creeping up. And that means that imports has declined, and you can see imports and exports are now the same, and consumption and production are roughly the same. which brings me to oil refining in the United States. The USA has very substantial oil refining capacity. We recently looked at China, which is the largest capacity in the world. US is just behind that with 18 million barrels of oil, crude oil refining. And these big refineries, mainly on the US Gulf Coast, but spread also over to other states on the coast, are run by Marathon and Valero and Exxon and Phillips and Chevron and a few other companies. In fact, there are 124 such oil refineries that produce the liquid fuels of gasoline and diesel fuel and jet fuel and heating oil and asphalt and petrochemicals for plastics and other materials for the United States. Big focus in the country on reducing sulfur content, and from time to time there's a shift as Venezuelan crude becomes unpopular, or more Middle Eastern crude or more Canadian crude comes into the system. The refinery that you see on screen is Galveston Bay, the biggest oil refinery in North America with 630,000 barrels per day, operated by Marathon. Next, we kind of start with coal and morph into gas, because the US coal industry has seen a very significant decline. Coal production peaked in 1990 at over 1 billion tons of coal, and has now fallen to 40% of that, 400 million tons. And it was broadly spread across the US, but today it's concentrated in Wyoming and Pennsylvania and West Virginia. And most of the produced coal goes into electricity generation, as we will see later. But that's declining because so much of that is now taken over by gas. The US still also exports a small portion of its coal, about 20 million tons, to Asia, particularly Japan and Korea. And this picture from the satellite picture from Paris looks down on the North Antelope Rochelle coal mine, which is the largest coal mine in the world, run by Peabody. And if you stare at the screen where each of the red dots are, you can see that a very large number of open pits for open cast mining of coal in Wyoming. And it's been producing since 1983. Now produces 62 million tons of coal per year, and still has very, very large reserves. And yes, Wyoming and other states are seeking to repurpose these vast coal reserves and say, what can we do with clean coal, or what can we do with clean coal and carbon capture and sequestration? Having referenced electricity, let's just see where the US's electricity comes from. This picture since the year 2000 shows from the bottom the fact that gas is now at 42% of power generation in the country. Nuclear is second largest at 18, coal is still 16, wind at the top in green is 10, hydro 5, and solar also 5, but you can see the rate at which the growth is being absorbed by wind and solar. And speaking of gas as the largest source of power, the US gas transmission system, which connects it to Canada and Mexico, is massive. 5 million kilometers of pipelines that are either large diameter, high pressure interstate pipelines and much smaller intrastate pipelines that reach consumers across the lower 48 states, delivering gas from the producing areas to consumers. And it plays a really important role in supplying the natural gas power plants in the country, because looking down over the US here, you can see spread over the country the largest of the gas-fired power plants that sit across the United States, producing 42% of the electricity that we spoke of earlier. And they can all be ramped up and down quickly to meet fluctuations in electricity demand, making them ideal for balancing the increasing use of renewables that we will come to in a moment. Let's visit one of those stations. And you see here in Florida, the Sunshine State power plant called West County. And look down on that. It's the largest in the United States, and produces a significant portion of Florida's electricity needs. And below us, we can see that the generators and the air coolers and the switch yards in the foreground, 3 times 1,215 megawatts. Despite the rise of renewables, natural gas power generation is still expanding. 2016 saw 16 natural gas power plants come on stream, the total capacity of 8 gigawatts. And this year we'll see a further, this year in 2025, we'll see a further 20 natural gas fired power plants come online, further 8 gigawatts to be added. Before we get to renewables, I'm still going to stop with nuclear for a moment, because the situation around nuclear is in some ways so stable and some fluid. As we will see in a moment, nuclear power has flatlined in terms of its power generation. There are currently, but I will report on that, despite a lot of interest, no small modular reactors or fusion reactors under construction at a commercial level. And the question is whether Bill Gates's TerraPower can rise to the rescue. But let's first take stock of where the US nuclear fleet is, because below us in the purple markers, you see the US nuclear power plants. There are 93 reactors in 30 states, strategically located and distributed over those. 41 reactors are already shut, and most of them still need to be decommissioned. Very significant. The average age of each of those nuclear power plants that you see on screen are 42 years. And you can compare that mentally with China, for which it's 10 years, and Europe, for which it's 38 years. They are simple technology, pressurized water and boiling water reactors, and have been operating since the first one was built in 1957. 2 incidents, the 3 Mile Island incident in 1978 and Fukushima in 2011, were significant setbacks for expansion and added to public resistance. But of late, shutdowns are largely mean that due to natural gas competition and the emergence of renewables. And particular of the US is that life extension required by license after 40 years is costly. So since the year 2000, really only 2 projects have started. And we'll visit one of those in a moment. Big open issue in the US is the storage and disposal of spent fuel, because there's no national repository and reprocessing is not permitted. But let's be clear, under the Infrastructure Investment Act and Jobs Act, and now the Inflation Reduction Act, life extension and new nuclear is heavily promoted. 8 states are promoting new nuclear. 9 utilities in 18 states are doing feasibility studies and siting studies for nuclear. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But let's visit 3 places. Let's visit 2 nuclear power plants, one at Palo Verde, one at Votele, and then also go to the TerraPower site in a moment. We look down at what was, until the end of last year, America's largest nuclear power plant. You can see below us the 3 reactor buildings on the left-hand side, the strange coolers and ponds for cooling water, because this nuclear power plant at Palo Verde in Arizona has this particular cooling system using wastewater from local cities. And the 3 pressurized water reactors together produce 4,000 megawatts. This plant has been in operation since 1986, means it's now almost 40 years old. And these units can run till the end of the 2040s, till they are 60 years old in terms of their current licenses. Our second visit is in Georgia to Votele, which sits in Waynesboro and is operated by Southern, co-owned by Georgia Power. And on the left-hand side, we see the 2 old reactors, which were installed already in the 1980s, 1,200 megawatts each. And on the right-hand side, we see the 2 new Westinghouse AP1000 reactors, which came to commercial operation, one in July last year and April last year, April this year. And this is now the largest operating nuclear plant in the United States after that. Next, we travel to Wyoming, and I'll explain the picture that we see in a moment. But before doing so, let's just remind ourselves that until 2023, NuScale was the leader in small modular technology in the United States, designing compact reactors for cheaper and safer nuclear power. Their first planned project in Idaho with 6 reactors was cancelled last year due to lack of interest, as costs for those plants rose from 3.6 billion to 9.3 billion. So here we look down at the plant in Wyoming, where TerraPower wants to build its natrium reactor. What do we see? We see two old coal pits. We see the Norton coal and gas-fired station, which converted from coal to gas. And we see the site for the first SMR to be built in the US. The 45 megawatt of molten salt storage will boost it to 500 megawatts electrical. TerraPower is doing this in cooperation between GE, Hitachi, and Pacific Corp. And it's currently in the permitting stage and hopes to start construction this year. And this week, the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission accepted TerraPower's construction permit application for review. And this is the first time in more than 40 years that the NRC has docketed an application for a commercial non-light water reactor. And so this is a new technology that will break the old pressurized and boiling water reactor. But let me close with a few closing words on where is nuclear in the US going. Also this week, on Tuesday, the US Senate passed a bill to accelerate the deployment of nuclear energy capacity to include speeding up of permitting, creating new incentives for advanced nuclear reactor technologies. And one of the nuclear operators, Southern Company's CEO this week said that he expected more industry commitments to build the 1,000 megawatt large scale light water nuclear reactors in the US before the year 2030. So let's watch this space. That's what that proposed natrium reactor plant in Wyoming will look like. Next, I turn to LNG, where the US is surpassing Qatar and Australia in LNG exports, but now with a pause. Below us, we see the 7 LNG export terminals in operation today. And last year, the US was 83 million tons of export. Quite amazing after only having started in 2016. But a further 80 million tons per year, so exactly the same amount that is currently in operation, is currently under construction at Sabine Pass, Plaquemines, at Driftwood, at Corpus Christi, expanding the Cheniere plant at Port Arthur, at Rio Grande, and Calcasieu Pass, another expansion by Venture Global. But on top of that, a further 88 million tons is pre-FID, so approved, but not under construction. And most of these plants from Lake Charles all the way down to Delphin and Port Arthur have now been paused by the Biden administration, especially under the non-FTA export rules. And the Department of Energy has said it will take a hard look at the carbon footprint of the US energy industry to verify if energy exports are in the public interest. This is mostly seen as an electioneering decision. It'll cost the project's bottom left in that from Lake Charles down to Delphin, probably at least 18 months of delay and uncertainty. Whilst these projects can't progress, other non-US projects are getting ready to fill the gap. And we saw the FID announcement, say, by ADNOC on Ruwais LNG last week. Let's visit 2 of those plants briefly. We go to Sabine Pass and Calcasieu Pass. And here below us, we see the Sabine Pass of Cheniere plant, that exported the first cargoes in 2016. You can see the LNG trains, all 6 of them. You can see the energy storage tanks, and you can see the LNG tankers loading. And from here, LNG has gone to 20 countries through either Panama or across the Atlantic and through Suez. Our second visit is to Calcasieu Pass here in Louisiana on the Gulf of Mexico, operated by Venture Global, 20 million tons per year. And this these liquefaction modules were delivered to site, employing multiple pre-cooled single-mix refrigerant blocks. Quite simply, it was absolutely constructed in a breathtakingly fast time. Really, operations started in 2002, but the controversy is that this is said to not yet be in commercial operation, and all the 6 long-term off-takers have now started various forms of protest and proceedings against Venture Global. But Venture Global is also a great political player and knows what to do, and last week signed an agreement with Ukraine for its first liquefied energy deal with an American company to help avert the energy supply crunch amidst the war with Russia. We're going to slowly migrate to the electricity sector, but let's just look at what's happening on the electricity demand, because the data economy, electrification is increasing power needs despite the apparent Q1 EV slowdown. And as Mary said in her introduction, US electric load is growing much faster than grid planners previously expected. And a lot of that is led by reshoring of manufacturing industry and the growth of data centers. And there's a broad consensus now that the US has reached electricity demand inflection point. And with uncertainty still as to what the impact of electrification is going to be, hydrogen production is going to be, reindustrialization is going to be. And various reports filed with FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, shows that grid planners now see 5% growth over the next 5 years, compared to just 2.5% 2 years ago. Peak demand is expected to grow by 38 gigawatts. And the grid is not prepared for significant load growth. It has not been prepared for that. And as Mary said, load transfer capability between states is probably and regions is probably the key risk for reliability. This map shows us the data centers in the US, and both cloud computing and artificial intelligence and crypto mining, although crypto mining is down, are extremely data hungry and power consumption heavy. And these data centers that you see spread across the US are absolutely worthless without reliable power. And so the large tech firms such as Amazon and Microsoft and Google and Meta and Equinix and Apple are seeking to control their own destiny and unwilling to rely on utilities. So they begin to operate, and each of these data centers consume, depending on the size, between 10 and 100 megawatts of power. If we just look at Google for a moment, Google's energy usage is currently growing at 20% compounded annual growth rate. And last week, it entered into an agreement with Berkshire Hathaway to power its Nevada data center with advanced geothermal electricity. What does such a data center look like? Let's visit one of them up in Oregon in the northwest of the country. And Meta, the parent of Facebook, operates data centers in 18 US states, including Oregon. And this one in Prineville has a focus, which is largely Meta's focus on artificial intelligence. They don't run really cloud computing services. And so these buildings and sites are optimized for AI workloads. And Meta relies and invests very heavily in these data centers. They often cost $1 billion, conserve water at them. But that's not all. In Prime, and next to it, you see Apple's data center, also in Oregon. And this is big new business in energy. I also pause for a moment to just look at the US picture as far as electric vehicle sales are concerned for its energy supply impacts. We see that currently hybrid and electric and plug-in hybrids are about 18% of the overall market share. President Biden has said that he wants that to be at 50% by 2030. And worryingly, what we see on the right-hand side is that the electric car has suddenly dropped in the first quarter. Car sales has dropped in the first quarter of 2024. And the combination of high prices for EVs, in part due to tariffs on Chinese imports, the lack of charging infrastructure, the short driving ranges, and the complex tax credits, although $7,500 is available if the car and the battery is made in the US, is making it difficult for US consumers. There's also only 640,000 public stations in the US, which is half the number of filling stations. And there's not a lot of Chinese manufacturing other than Polestar within the country. So let's see where this goes. Also, in terms of the energy transition, the EU is very concerned about the new geopolitics of energy and mining and minerals. And especially as China rises to be the electrostate, producing PV panels and wind turbines, electric vehicles and batteries for the world. At the sort of large bulk materials, the concern is about nickel, copper, lithium, and cobalt. But in general, China doesn't control those, and the US is specifically seeking to increase its reliance on Canada and Australia where possible. But when we look at the so-called critical materials, which are specialized for various uses, we see the reliance of the US, 100% import reliance, and the main source of arsenic is China, used for semiconductors. Fluorspar is used in steel, glass, ceramics, fridge, and batteries, and that is fortunately not a Chinese reliance. Gallium is a Chinese reliance, and it's used for semiconductors and LEDs and solar cells. Graphite is used for lubricants, batteries, and fuel cells, full Chinese reliance. Scandium alloys used for alloys and light aerospace. We can see fortunately that reliance is on Europe. And then tantalum for electronic components, capacitor, and super alloys, a Chinese reliance. Yttrium, used for ceramics in lasers, also a Chinese reliance. And rare earths, which are used in magnets, screens, batteries, alloys, and catalysts, also a Chinese reliance. That lies behind Janet Granholm and Amos Hochstein's concerns about the future. A lot of that impacts both the wind industry and the solar industry that we're about to see. And our headlines on wind is that wind is growing fast across the country, but particularly in Texas, Iowa, and Oklahoma, and that the offshore has been paused. And we look down on the US and we see the largest of each of the blue markers is a large wind farm in the United States. And we see both the onshore ones, but on the top right, you see also, I've named them Block Island, South Fork, and Coastal Virginia as the three offshore wind farms. And you can see quite clearly onshore how that's concentrated in Texas and Oklahoma and Iowa. And we're all aware, as far as constellation is concerned, of the ocean wind constellations in New Jersey by Ørsted and the New York one by BP and Equinor. So currently in 2024, there are major renewed wind energy solicitations in Connecticut and in Massachusetts and in Rhode Island and New York and New Jersey, all seeking to revitalize an offshore wind industry in the country. Let's go to California to look at the largest wind farm in the United States, Alta Wind, that you can see there. And we go to South Fork of Rhode Island as well. And here in the southern Mojave Desert, we see the Alta Wind Center, 1,550 megawatts in that white area. You can see all the wind generators that are quite small turbines from Vestas and GE sit there along on those lines in the desert, leveraging the strong winds of the Tehachapi Pass. And here at the South Fork offshore wind farm off Long Island and Rhode Island in New York, we see the largest offshore wind farm in the US. It's 30 kilometers off Rhode Island and Long Island. And there are only, and I use this word advisedly, there are only 12 Siemens Gamesa 11 megawatt turbines. So it's about 120 or 132 megawatts of capacity at this. But it's a good learning curve for the United States, and also incorporates the first offshore substation ever manufactured in the United States for a wind farm. Both General Electric and Vestas manufacture large wind turbines in the US. And below us, we see the nacelle factory and the blade factory and the rail yard for delivery of Vestas's plant in Brighton, Colorado. Before leaving wind and just reminding ourselves of what that map looked like, on the right-hand side, you can just see the gray areas. You see the significant new interstate transmission that needs to be built in the US to accommodate wind and solar. And that's one of the big challenges, because grid interconnection costs are rising rapidly. The backlog has jumped 40%. Long waiting times, even with the IRA. The environmental challenges is the largest reason for that. A lot of public NIMBYism. So in response, and as a stopgap measure, very large battery systems are being installed upstream of substations to avoid network upgrades. But that has now led to transformers and switchgear waiting times running up to 5 years, and quite a lot of wind and solar curtailment rapidly rising because of transmission distribution bottlenecks. It is repeatedly said that a big transmission line that you see on the right-hand side often requires as much as 13,000 permits and takes 15 to 20 years to complete. And a breakthrough will need to be achieved. It is urgently necessary in the United States. Having looked at wind briefly, we also look at solar, which is escalating very rapidly in California, Texas, and Florida. On this map here, you see the 5,000 solar farms in the US. You can see on the left-hand side, blew out California, and on the right-hand side, blew out the Sunshine States. And this is happening very fast. They're all photovoltaic, very few concentrated solar plants. And the Inflation Reduction Act has made it so attractive to buy, to install solar, with enhanced tax credits for homeowners, production tax credits for solar power energy, domestic solar panel manufacturing boost through tax credits and grants, low income housing tax credits for solar power, solar research funding, streamlined permitting for solar farms and installation. But the big question that is always asked, so can the US sustain this in terms of its own solar panel manufacturing? The answer is absolutely not. Last year, the US imported 54 gigawatts of solar panels from Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam and Cambodia and Malaysia and Thailand, often proxies for China. Let's visit 3 solar farms quickly to just see what these look like from space. And this picture, I hope, stays with you after today's presentation, because no area in the US has seen growth in solar like the Southern Mojave Desert in California. And looking down, each of those red dots is a solar farm in operation and construction. That is on a scale that equals the best that I can show you in China or in India or in the Middle East. It is amazing. The absence of much needed transmission build out, though, is causing delays in the rate at which this can be brought to market. But this is quite amazing. And this, for me, is the equivalent of what one saw in the Permian in terms of just private sector deploying capital and expertise into the market. Our second is the familiar Ivan Park concentrated solar plant in California. And you can see across the 3 solar parks, concentrated solar parks on the left-hand side, each with a sodium tower in the middle, the 173,000 mirrors that follow the sun with a total installed capacity of 392 megawatts. You can also see to the northeast of the picture, the State Line photovoltaic plant right next to it. And the last one, our last solar visit, is in Los Angeles, and we look down at the Westmount rooftop solar facility. This is 50,000 panels that you see on top of this Westmount shopping center. And that generates 16.4 megawatts, which is the largest rooftop installation in the world. And this serves also as a testing ground for all aspects of solar technology, including a locally operated smart grid and energy storage that goes with it. If we look at the contribution of the various energy forms in the United States, you can see the solar line in yellow at the bottom. You can see the daily curve across the United States. You can see that currently the US solar is generating about 70,000 megawatts during the day, very substantial. You can see wind just below it, also sometimes reaching 80, 90,000 megawatts. You can see the nuclear line, which is the red line that runs from left to right on the screen, at also 80,000 megawatts. And then you can see natural gas, which takes up all the load following of the load curves and the intermittency of solar and wind at the top. You can see that generated in that week roughly 230,000 megawatts. To deal with the low load factors of renewables in the US, there's significant batteries being installed in Texas and California and other states, but it is still, compared to the size of that electrical system that we saw a moment ago, quite small and insignificant in scale. But again, I warned earlier, the US deploys capital and technology so fast. But a number of power security crises are predicted. The map that we see here is of the storage, big power storage facilities in the United States, both pump storage and battery storage. The US power system has a maximum demand of 500 gigawatts. And as far as pump storage is concerned, the US has the second largest pump storage capacity in the world, a total of 43 plants with a total of 22 gigawatts. So you can compare 22 gigawatts with 500 gigawatts of maximum demand. Total storage capacity is 553 gigawatt hours. So that's, in fact, quite small to what was the old US power system. And significantly, there are no large pump storage stations under construction in the US right now, quite unlike China that we saw recently. So each of the P's that you see marked in blue is a pump storage station. But I also show you the battery storage, which is still insignificant, but rising fast in Texas and in California. And in green, marked with a B, you see all the large battery storage systems in the country. Last year was a bumper year. The Inflation Reduction Act helps battery storage, and market is also growing quite rapidly in Arizona, Nevada, New York, and Florida to ensure grid stability, which is quite slightly different from dealing with intermittency of sun and wind. Let's visit two of those. And we first go to Bath County Pump Storage Station, then we go to Moss Landing in California. Here in Virginia, you see the US's largest pump storage station. It's 3,000 megawatts. There's a difference of 380 meters between the upper reservoir on the left and the lower reservoir on the right, and you can see where the generating and pumping station is. And this can get to full load in as little as 2 minutes and is going to be used a lot to deal with power system phenomena. Now, second visit is here in California to the Moss Landing facility, which is the largest in the United States and probably in the world, I would say. And you can see in the foreground a combined gas-fired station of 1,000 megawatts owned by Vistra. And then where it says phase 1 and phase 2 is the Moss Landing, about 1,600 megawatt hours of storage facility in 2 phases. And on the left hand, another battery storage called Elkhorn. And this is all lithium-ion technology, and with all the implications of how much lithium-ion storage capacity is available. I won't spend a lot of time, but when the North American Electric Reliability Corporation issues power grid warnings, which stem from aging power infrastructure, which stems from doubling of the demand growth to 5%, the intermittency of solar and wind, the explosion in data centers, and the long lead times for building generation and transmission and storage, then we should probably take that quite seriously, and I'll leave it at that. I briefly pause before I begin to conclude to say the US doesn't have a price for carbon, so progress with implementing CO2 storage has been very slow beyond the use of CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. And here we look down on the Chute Creek gas processing facility with carbon capture in Wyoming, the largest in the United States, operated by ExxonMobil, can do 7 million tons of CO2 capture. And where you see gas processing and CO2 removal is where the CO2 which comes in with the gas stream is removed, and that CO2 stream is then used for enhanced oil recovery. There are 3 other big such plants: Longfellow in Texas, the Illinois plant in Illinois, and the Great Plains Synfuel plant in Weyburn Middale project in North Dakota. Last one deals with CO2 from coal gasification. So growing slowly, but not yet at scale. As far as hydrogen is concerned, like in Europe, gray hydrogen produced from natural gas through steam methane, steam reforming of methane, remains the dominant form of hydrogen in the US, but the US is now clear that it has set aside through the DOE and other departments 7 hydrogen hubs, and we see those on screen. But they are all quite bespoke designs for the region. The Appalachian hydrogen hub has set $900 million aside for low-cost natural gas and carbon dioxide sequestration options. The California hydrogen hub set $1 billion aside for producing hydrogen from renewables or biomass. The Gulf Coast hydrogen hub in Texas has set $1 billion aside for large-scale hydrogen production using natural gas with carbon capture and renewable-powered electrolysis. The Heartland Hydrogen Hub of Minnesota and North Dakota and South Dakota has set $900 million aside to help decarbonize the agricultural sector of that area, helping them with the production of fertilizer and decreasing the regional cost of hydrogen to use it for power generation. The Mid-Atlantic Hydrogen Hub of Pennsylvania and Delaware and New Jersey has set $700 million aside to repurpose historic oil infrastructure and use existing rights of way to support the development of a hydrogen cluster of using renewables and nuclear electricity. And then the Midwest Nuclear Hydrogen Hub in Illinois and Indiana and Michigan has set $1 billion aside to produce hydrogen from renewable energy and low-cost nuclear. And they also then want to use hydrogen for steel and glass production and refining and sustainable aviation fuel. And lastly, the Pacific Northwest Hydrogen Hub of Washington and Oregon and Montana has set $1 billion aside to produce clean hydrogen from electrolysis. So all of that, I would say, conceptually in place, but final tax credit guidance is still in the air. The hydrogen companies end up suing the Treasury Department for its proposal to require green hydrogen to use new renewable energy for fuel resources, as Europe has done. which will mean that hydrogen projects, green hydrogen projects, will have to wait 3 or 4 years for these projects to come online first. And so we will see how this plays out in 2024 and 5 and 26. We stopped briefly in California and looked down on the so-called SoHyCal green hydrogen plant, the largest in the US. So is for solar, Hi is for hydrogen, Cal is for California. But this produces 1 ton of hydrogen per day, due to be scaled up to 3 tons per day in the near future, powered by photovoltaic power. I close by then say, what does this mean for the nationally determined contribution of the United States? In 1990, the US's greenhouse gas emissions were 6,500 metric tons, or 6.5 gigatons. That at peak, as we saw earlier, when oil and gas production and co-production and consumption peaked at about 7.5 in the early 2000s. And currently in 2024 or 2023, the US is back at the 1990 levels due to the fact that coal was replaced by natural gas due to the growth of solar, but yes, also due to the decline of heavy industry in the United States as a result of steel and chemicals and textiles going abroad. And the question now is that faces President Biden, President Trump, and us is, if all the US policy and actions are implemented, the US may get to 5 gigatons or 5,000 metric tons in 2030. Its NDC target that is tabled under the Paris Accord is 4,000. If the world is to get to 1.5 degrees by 2050, that's where the US needs to be. And in terms of old carbon and new carbon and loading in the atmosphere and historical load and yield, if the US is to, what others calculate, to carry its fair share, that, Mary, is where it needs to be. President Biden's target is to get a 50% reduction by 2030 on the 2005 level, so 7,500 down to 3.5, which is below the NDC target. I have no idea what will happen if under a Trump administration. Mary, with that, back to you, the same headlines.
Well, thank you so much, Andy. And we've certainly attempted to cover the diversity and scope that is the US energy system and alluded to some of the challenges and opportunities. Everyone's welcome to rejoin on video, but please keep your audio off unless you're posing a question. And on the question and contributions front, I've been busy trying to compile all of those questions, which we will address as best we can, shared on the screen, and I'll still be adding to them as they're still streaming in. We are going to start with some contributions from Terry and Michael
and Alex.
And Alex, and we will start with those, and then I think Andy's going to put the questions that we've compiled up on the screen, and we will follow with those. I did want to make, as Alex and Terry get set up with their audio, just following on Andy's comments about the CO2 reduction trajectory. And as I mentioned, I'm on a number of boards of energy companies and in US based. And the sense is that the easy tracks have been achieved, and with the conversion of coal to gas, the US had a bit of headway on that front, but it's really challenging environment to achieve more for the complex of issues that we presented, and we'll delve specifically into those areas. So over to Terry.
Well, greetings from Texas, and send me some of that snow. We're in our 10th consecutive month of record temperatures. And now we have a tropical storm coming through Houston right now as we do this. And it's only June, so I can hardly wait for the rest of the summer. I want to quickly pick up on the last thing that Andy said, and that was about that we have no idea what's going to happen under the Trump administration. Also, that as far as obviously the Inflation Reduction Act is the most important climate action Biden has taken. I just want to emphasize that this act has not been implemented. We are a long way from any implementation of the act. You've seen the controversy over, defining what some of the green parameters are. It's just a long list of things that haven't been done, so we really haven't seen the impact yet. And secondly, if every bit of the Inflation Reduction Act is being litigated right now, unless it has anything to do with fossil fuels, and we have a very sympathetic, or I should say for Biden, an unfriendly Supreme Court. So regardless of who's president, we'll see continued litigation of all aspects of this. You brought up carbon capture, utilization, and storage. I just would advise everybody, if you want to watch the progress on this, pay attention to the Gulf Coast of the United States. We have the infrastructure here. We have ample storage capacity. We have a good pool of companies who are looking into this. So it's a good place to monitor. And we're seeing the same problem, though, that we're seeing with the hydrogen, is that obviously for a project to be successful, you have to have a takeaway contract. Who's going to buy the product on this? And we haven't seen the willingness yet of manufacturers or people who would use this to shut down their facilities, add on to the carbon capture stuff, that would need to work. And we're probably going to see the same thing on the hydrogen side. But again, I would watch the Gulf Coast for both of those things. But so what are people talking about in this election? It's incredible. Obviously, electricity demand, you've touched upon that. You've done a really good job on the issues here. Electric vehicles, getting rid of gas water heaters and stoves, new manufacturing facilities, et cetera, and these data centers. This is shocker. You go back 2 years, you won't see anybody talking about electricity demand. What you didn't mention is the climate impact on the grid and the strain that we are seeing due to extreme weather. And what we've seen so far this year is these extreme events are affecting both the supply of energy, whether it's gas production, is also affecting the infrastructure. And extreme weather is making power outages trend higher, and the South and the Southeast has experienced the most of this. So we look at the grid, it's not only building out the grid, but to deal with the changing weather patterns. And, we've seen more power outages in the last 2 years than we've seen in the last 20 years. So most of these due to weather events. Price has become a huge issue in this election. It's even become an issue in Texas. Now, most people on this call think about price or talking about oil and gas prices. But what I'm talking about is the cost of electricity to households. It's even becoming an issue here in Texas. We've got like 25% of the people in the United States are struggling to pay their power bills. And this is coming back. And it's really fascinating to see in Texas here some pushback against some of these data centers. And our lieutenant governor just this past week has raised the question, what do we get for this? We have bring these data centers to Texas and strain the grid. They're not large employers, and there's some really rethinking on this. This all goes back to a huge concern to the price issues here. Utility bills are projected to go up 8% this year. So if you look at the politics and the direction we're going to go, I think the cost equation is going to become more and more important in this. I'm glad to see what you flagged, that keep an eye on what's going on at the state level. You see these big national battles over some of these policy issues, but every regulatory agency throughout the state are doing some incredible things in trying to sort out how to integrate more energy efficiency in here, distributed energy resources. Several utility commissions have put together regulations to deal with aggregators now, allowing people to come into the grid systems there and be an aggregator of distributed energy and bring those into the grid. It's been more focused at the state level on energy efficiency and heat pumps. So while we may stumble at the federal level on some of these issues, I think some of the more innovative things are being done at the state level. And the last thing I want to mention is on the price side is where are we going to go on natural gas prices? And Andy mentioned that, the pause on the new LNG facilities, even though we're going to have a 40% increase in takeaway capacity in the next few years, is a climate impact driven. Actually, there is concern, and a large group of manufacturers have gone to the administration saying, what is the future impact on gas prices going to be? Gas production is down. A lot of that's due to lack of takeaway capacity, especially in the Northeast. But gas production is down, and that's a huge question. Will the expanded LNG exports and the increased demand raise gas prices? I also put the other side of that is how important are the LNG exports to maintain a price level that will in fact support gas production. And I was hoping that this would come out of this LNG discussion. It hasn't, but maybe it will next year. But other than that, it's pretty quiet here in the U.S.
Well, thanks so much for that commentary.
Yeah.
All important dimensions of the complex that is the U.S. and as I said at the outset, quite worrying. In terms of the tracks that are being followed, the many divergent tracks. So we'll pick up on some of those points. Tony, maybe we'll let Alex offer his comments, and then we'll go into, I think Andy's going to put up the questions as well.
Hey there. I'll try to keep my comments somewhat short. As Anthony knows, I ran half the world's LNG business for Shell. So I've got, my fossil fuel background is drilling, production, LNG. Since leaving Shell, right now I'm chairman of a waste to energy project that we're trying to do in New Mexico. And so it's involved in these green hubs. So I just want to talk about that for a second. With the Inflation Reduction Act, you'd think that it's easy to move through these sorts of things. I'm telling you, it is not easy to move through these sorts of things. We're looking for about $250 million of financing, and the financing side of the business is difficult. Nobody believes in hydrogen in financing, so it's a tough sell when you go to finance some of these things that are out there. And you might think that the Inflation Reduction Act puts a lot of money in your pocket to do it. We've yet to find it in the middle of our project, and we've searched and tried to find these grants. But the two big main things I want to talk about, Terry hit the first one, is cost. Europe went through its cost shock with Russian gas being shut off, and moving there. U.S. hasn't done that at all yet, but it's coming. The other part of my time I spend at the Jersey Shore, one of those projects was just canceled because of cost. It was that simple. Even the governors couldn't reach down into their pocketbooks and make that fly. That was going on. And then I think the final thing is, as we look here, we talk about transition. Is the transition happening? You finally look at the bottom numbers. You still have 80% fossil fuels running the states. And as sophisticated as Texas and California are in dealing with their energy loads going forward, both of those states are just the edge of either rolling brownouts during peak times, or in Texas case, which has a very sophisticated system, a couple of years ago in a blizzard, the grid almost went out for the entire state, which would have been absolutely catastrophic.